Hiya. Here is a 10-minute, I hope, version of the new system that I'm writing in because I said I would share that around to some people and hope it's helping. If you're not one of these people, can I ask you to be ethical and turn this off? I don't know how you got the link. Okay, what I found was moving from theatre to film was really difficult because writing screenplays is a lot harder and a lot more disciplined than writing for stage. And the reason for that is because things are literal. So when you say something's underwater on stage, green lighting, a few bubbles, the audience's imagination does the rest. If you say it in film, you better have a diving team. Also, film audiences pay less attention. They're not in a physical space that's going to pay attention all the time. So the work has to carry them by the hand a little more and think of them as having less attention. So what I was finding was that people were giving me great advice, but I didn't have a structure to put it in. So people were going, it really is all about character. It really is all about stopping your characters getting what they want. But nobody was giving me a shape to work with. So what I did was I took something that I've used for years and kind of melded it with some of the screenplay stuff. And that really helped me. So when I used to make theatre, a lot of it was site specific and promenade, which meant that every scene had a location, right? And walking to that location took a certain amount of time. So what I would do is I would write scenes knowing how long the scene and the walk to it had to be. And that sits very neatly along with screenwriting methodology, which is very much kind of taken with that in as an idea, where to do a 90-minute anything, you take 5 post-its in a row, 5 post-its in a column, and you make 8 columns. Now, if you think of it roughly as these 8 columns are a little over 10 minutes each, then it becomes a lot easier. Like if you're doing something that's an hour, you do 6 columns. If you're doing something that's 90 minutes, you do 8 columns. You tend to run over a little bit, but what that means is that you have 8 movements, if you like, inside a narrative. And each of those movements potentially has 5 beats, so 5 post-its. And those post-its are about 2 pages each, roughly. Now, this kind of math really helps me because it reminds me that if I want something, I have to want it badly enough to be able to fit it into this. I can't just keep adding time. And as someone who gets interested in everything, what I find is that it keeps the writing muscular, the same way that writing for promenade and then developing it with actors used to keep it muscular. Because actors and promenades are brilliant at cutting out shit you don't need because everybody's too tired. So what I've got down is that the first thing that you do once you've got this layout is to populate it. You start by putting in, and I have 3 different types of post-it that I make at this stage, okay? One of them is imagery, events or moments. So for me, that's literally things I want to see. It's things I can see in my head that are going to happen. I don't have to know what they mean. I just know that I want an explosion. I don't know if the explosion is at the end and is killing everybody off, or whether the explosion is halfway through and is taking out the transport. I don't know what the thing is for necessarily, but I write it down as a moment. So you write down all your moments that you can think of, that you can see in your head, or that you want to see, or that you want your audience to experience. If it's a play, promenade play, I would also be writing events where it's like, and then snow falls from the ceiling. Like, it's not just about story. It's like, it's literally, what are the things that are happening to or in front of the audience? And you put these all down. Now, while you're putting these down, what will happen, once you make a big list of these, you not try to place them yet, is that these two guys will show up, okay? And one of them, that pink one, it says logics, and the bottom one says Q for questions. So, as you're putting together your moments, what will happen is that the logic behind the moment might suggest itself. So that doesn't have to be something that's literal. It could be that you notice that you've got 3 different post-its and they're all tied together with something to do with teenage girls. So you're like, there is a teenage girl logic going on in this piece. The other thing that might show up is questions. So if you're not getting a logic, you might get a question. So a question that I have in this one has got magic in it. I have questions about how the magic works. I have questions about how the real world people are or are not aware of the logic, of the magic. So what happens is, once you get all of these together, you start to be able to see a shape in the thing that you're doing. So what you'll have, if you don't have the whole of the story yet, is that you will end up with stuff that looks like that. So what happens is, I discovered that those 4 blue questions all belonged together, and they were all to do with the main character and magic, and how that related. I discovered that the logic, the next one up, was about teenage girls, but that I also had a question about a character who's a teenage girl. Over here, I've got ones that are questions about how empowered the character is or not. And then what I had was a logic around why that was. So logics aren't quite answers, but they're just things that every world that you make has a logic to it and has things that are its primary concern. So that's kind of what the logics are about. So once I've got all of that, I bang down the moments where I think they go, right? So again, if we go back to the big view, like what that means to me is I have a vibe of what is roughly an opening thing, right? So it goes that way, right? And usually what happens, and it's happened so you can kind of see it, I almost always know how things end. So I get my stuff in there first, and then I go and work backwards from there. But it doesn't matter if you don't know. So what you're doing is that you're looking at it, and here are roughly how I divide it out. You have beginning, so like that's beginning is like opening with a bang, and getting to know people, and planting logics, and getting, if it's a thriller, and mine normally are, getting like the thrill in early, of like start the clock, right? Equally, towards the end, sorry, I'm having to hold my camera in an odd way here to get this to work. Towards the end, what you've got is things that you're like, okay, I definitely know how things end because that's just in my nature. But what that means is that in the beat, in the movement before that, I've got to set up everything going shit-shaped. So things going shit-shaped, even worse than going shit-shaped here. So kind of shit-shaped here, very shit-shaped here. Then we have to resolve it, and either everybody's happy or everybody dies. The ones up here that are not the opening and seeding things are what I and Maggie Stiefel, the author, calls fun and games. That's like getting to know people, basically making sure everybody loves your characters, having us, I tend to accelerate quite fast, but you don't have to. Like, this might be the bits where your characters are having like fun, as opposed to dealing with the big thing. So what happens is you can kind of see how some things, like I've written things where this introductory is like 1 column, but I usually have a lot to set up, which means it's usually 2 columns. I would be bored if it went on to 3 columns, but that's just me. Equally, I have written finales that start around here and go on to like 3 columns. So you can see how it doesn't, you decide where the beginning, the middle and the end sections are. But the events that you have roughly normally suggest themselves as sitting in a particular shape. Now, once I've done that, what I then do is you'll notice that like these guys here, these ones, they don't have a home yet. I don't know where they live. And that's not a problem. Do you know, what I've done is I've banged down the events that I think I know where they live. And if there's been a question or a logic attached to that particular event or image, I've stuck that logic or question next to the event so I know what it is. But usually I would say about half is empty. About half the post-its are still empty. And that's because everything else is going to come from character. So what I do is I do a thing called, now I don't know where it is, let me see if I can find it. I do a thing that is a character profile. Now if you're an actor, this is where you absolutely win because you're so used to doing this. I use this book, so this is The Art and Science of Screenwriting by Philip Parker, and it has 2 pages of questions that are your character profiles. Now, you don't have to fill in everything in those 2 questions. What you have to have is just a solid sense of who that character is. Because as you write down each character and what they are, what they're like, you begin to see what's troublesome for them or what's not, and you begin to see what's easy for them and what's not, and you begin to see what's troublesome about them for the other characters. And what happens is, and I always think of it, it's like brain neurons firing, is that they start to join up. And what happens is it suggests all the other events that are going into these empty things, into these empty slots, will be filled by things that come from the character profile. Then you put the character-driven events onto the post-its. So you then decide where are you going to put all of these things. And that gives you a whole timeline. Now, one of the things that I might do at that point, just from a producing point of view, is that I might then go through the storyline and I might, if it was a film, I might list where all the locations are and look at how expensive this thing is. Because if I need to make it cheaper, it's easier to make it cheaper at this point than it is to make it cheaper when you've written a whole first draft. Then you do a whole blush of working your way through all 8 columns, making sure that all of the actions, so you take each character and you trace them through these different columns, and you make sure that you know what it is that they are about in each scene, like whether that's what they want or what are they avoiding or whatever, but you know what they're about in each scene, and you check that their character descriptions have turned into events. So this was a real winner for me. This was something I didn't do enough of before, where, for example, if I have a character in this one who is a recovered alcoholic, like who is a drinker, but instead of that being a character note that means, yeah, okay, so being in pubs is tense and what have you, what you do is you look at it and you go, how does that become a visible, actionable piece of event inside the story? Which means you have them fall off the wagon, or you have somebody else fall off the wagon and they have to help them. But instead of it simply being a character note, it becomes a character story beat. And that can take, and all of these, I'm grandiosely going, and then you bang all this down, and then you do all whatever. Each of these stages takes me about a week. So just so you know, it takes me about a week. And that's a full-on week, working hard at stuff. So this is the thing, is what you're doing is you're kind of giving everybody, you're using a screwdriver, you're tightening the torque on each of the things about a character. Once you've done that, you'll end up with all of this full, so you'll have your 8 columns with their 5 beats. You need to check that each of the columns with 5 post-its has a beginning, a middle, and an end of its own. And this is how, when you're watching a film and you go, this feels long, that's people who haven't done that. So that it doesn't feel long, you want a beginning, a middle, and an end in each movement that you're working together. working with. Now, sometimes it just doesn't happen. Like this one here, and this one here. These two movements, I can already tell are almost certainly, instead of being two columns of 5, are going to end up being like one column of 8. And that's going to have a beginning, middle, and end. So it's not that every single movement has to, every single movement does have to have it, but every single movement doesn't necessarily correspond perfectly with 5 post-its. So what you do is like leave post-its blank if you get to the end of a movement, you've nothing else for that movement, and move on to the next movement. And what happens is that by the time you've written it up and you've put loads of dialogue and stuff in, you're going to need that space empty anyway. So once you've done all of that, I then just go through, brush it all off, and try and make it more specific, more special, more meaningful, and more impactful. So impactful is a good word. So a lot of the time we talk about characters that we like, or things that they have, or things that they do, but we don't talk about the impact that has on an audience. So like, if someone is very sweet, what is the impact of that on the audience? Like, there's no point, you love them, it's different for you. What do you do for an audience who's just met them to make that sweetness be something that is impactful? So that's kind of that's all the stuff that I do to get through that. And then, one of the things that often happens by the time you're at that stage is you'll look back over it and realise that one of the characters isn't working properly, one or two of the characters are not working properly. And that throws you back to step 2, where you go back to the character profiles and tweak the character profiles, and then, once you've tweaked them, it'll tweak all of the events that come out of the character-driven events that you've put in the post-its. So I find I go back and forward on that step quite a lot. I get to the point where I think I'm done, and then I look at it and I realise that, like, my characters are still hip-hoppy, which means that they are functioning really well in parts of the story, and in other parts they're just kind of weight, and they're not doing anything. So finally, what I do is I then go back and I make the first 10 pages absolutely fecking amazing. Like, I make the first 10 post-its heart-stoppingly exciting or hugely atmospheric. I don't spend the openings of my things, that may be a personal thing, but I like to get the action started by page 2. Yours might be different from that, but what I would say is that as you move into writing the draft, remember that film is a visual medium, it's not a dialogue medium. So if you aren't astonished and gobsmacked by your own images in the first 10 pages, then you probably have to go back and raise the bar. And that is, I've done 2 like this just now, it's really worked for me. What it gives you is a really workable first draft that's kind of closer to what my third drafts used to be. I hope that's helpful.